Hello everyone, it's Miss Parish again, and welcome to part 2 of our fiction lecture for this semester. Before I start getting into chapters 5 through 8, which are what we're going to finish out with our fiction unit here in this video, I do want to kind of go over our guidelines for paper 1. So as you can see, I'm on our website, and I'm in the syllabus, handouts, and videos section, and I'm in the documents part here. So I wanted to start out by scrolling down here, and I see that some of you have already been downloading the paper 1 guidelines. Awesome. So I want to click on those and kind of run through them real quick, because I know some of you may have questions about paper 1. Paper 1, as you can see here, it's labeled prose. I did that because you have some options that are not just fiction. With this first paper, you have a lot of creative writing options, and it's up to you whether you want to pursue that or if you'd rather not do creative writing. That's entirely up to you. I have students that really like writing stories, and I've read some really good fiction papers, so it's really just up to you what you want to do for this first paper. As you can see, and I will zoom in here, that we do talk about prose, and your paper should incorporate the elements of fiction that we talked about not only in video 1, but that we are going to talk about in this video today. So as you can see here, that your paper needs to involve the elements or discuss the elements of setting, character, plot, point of view, symbolism, theme, and style. Now, I'm not a big prompt instructor. I don't like giving lots of prompts for papers. I never liked prompts as a student. I wanted to just pick a topic and write about it. So obviously we have to have some barriers. There needs to be some kind of constraint on the paper. Otherwise, the papers can get crazy. So I do have some options you guys can choose from, as you can see here. First, you can write your own fictional story. I have a lot of students choose this option. I've read stories from romance, comedies, to some cool criminal noir detective stories, just really short stories that incorporate the elements of fiction but are fun and that you have fun writing. So if you're somebody that likes to write, this might be an option for you. Or if you don't like making up stuff, you can write about an event that has happened in your life, in the life of a family member, or in your community. And I've read lots of papers on those, and they work great too. Writing from experience is an excellent start to your paper, and I would encourage you to choose that option if you so want to. Third is fan fiction. I don't know how many of you have heard of fan fiction before. It's basically where you take elements of a story that already exists and you make it your own. So an example would be in Harry Potter, you write about what happened to Neville, and you kind of just give your own take on it. Or I had a girl one semester that she really got into it, and she wrote a paper on, it was a fan fiction where the cast of Grey's Anatomy went to Las Vegas and hung out with the wolf pack from The Hangover. It was ridiculous, but it was really creative. It was fun, and she kind of gave a little blurb at the start of the paper explaining what the cast of Grey's Anatomy is like, what the cast of The Hangover is like, and why she chose to combine those together. And it worked really well. It was a fun paper. You could do that. Or finally, I realized that not everyone wants to write their own story. Not everyone has a creative writing bone in their body, and that's fine. So if that is the case, you can always choose a short story and you'll analyze it. This is not a book report. Book reports are one of my least favorite genres because usually what happens is the student or writer will just talk about the plot. They'll be like, here's what happens in The Hunger Games. I've read maybe 20 papers about The Hunger Games, so I'm a little burnt out on Katniss and her friends. But my point is that if you choose this fourth option, you should analyze the story. Tell me not only how it uses plot, but tell me about the characters, tell me about the setting. How is the style compared to other stories? What's the overall theme of the story? Is there any symbolism, which chances are there will be? I mean, I want you to kind of explore the story and pull these elements out and talk about them, and then kind of all wrap it up together, if that makes sense. So all 4 of these options I have seen A papers from. So they're definitely doable. I think it's just really up to you what you think is most comfortable for you as a writer. As far as formatting goes, they are 3 to 5 full pages. And by full pages, I mean, and I'm going to zoom out, this is a full page. I have some students that they get to page 3, they do 2 full pages, and they get to this 3rd page, and this little paragraph here is all they put. That's not 3 pages, that's 2 pages and maybe a quarter. So that's not what I want. I want 3 full pages. 3 to 5 is a good guideline. If you go over 5, I'm not going to count off on it. It's just kind of something to aim for if you want to keep yourself constrained. 12-point font, no bold, no cursive or large fonts. I know, I was a college student too. But sometimes students choose the really obvious giant, like I'm going to scroll up here, the real obvious fonts that are not they're not regular. As you can see here, this is not even a 12-point, this is an 11-point. But sometimes students choose, you know, something like American typewriter or Arial bold or something really huge, and it just doesn't work, right? Or blackout. Don't do that. But my point is, don't choose, you can choose whatever font you want, just don't choose one where it makes it hard to read. It does need to be double spaced with 1-inch margins. Now typically, if you open up a Word document like I have here and I look at the margins, they are all set at 1 inch. Every document you open on Microsoft Word should already be set to this. You shouldn't have to mess with it. Don't change the margins, just make sure they're 1 inch. And then make sure it's double spaced. So this is not double spaced here. So if I wanted to double space it, I would highlight my text, go to this little bar for line spacing and click 2, and that's what it should look like if it's double spaced. So not too hard. I'm going to undo that though. All right. And then as far as other formatting guidelines, it should incorporate the elements of fiction we've discussed in this video and in your discussion forums. I am going to look at grammar and spelling, obviously. You do not need a works cited for this page necessarily, because if you're choosing the creative writing option, you're not citing anything. If for some reason you do decide that you want to put an image in your paper, or you want to reference a review of the text or any outside source, you do need to cite that. So if you don't use any outside sources or images, you should be fine. But if so, please cite them, and I will definitely let you know if you need to when I grade your paper. And then obviously everything is due on time for a grade. That's again my big stickler, is that you just turn everything in on time. So for example, the paper 1 thesis was due Sunday, March 11th by 11:55, telling me what your topic of the paper is. And then our final draft should be submitted to the Dropbox by Sunday, March 25th. So like I said at the beginning of the semester in my other videos, this is an 8-week course, technically 9, 10 if you count spring break and finals week. So it does go by relatively quickly. So for that sake, I have given you a little bit of, you get a little bit more time with this first paper than papers 2 and 3, and then you'll get more time with the last paper because it's our research paper and it's a longer paper. But just be aware that on March 25th, this first paper is due, which it's only 3 pages. You should be able to handle that, I think. And then here is how the evaluation is broken down. So your topic was 100 points, and I count it separate than the 100 points of the essay. Grammar and spelling, I'm giving you 20 points worth of errors you can make. Page length and formatting, this means that it's 3 pages at least, that it's double spaced, it's 12-point font, it's legible, that just means you met all the formatting guidelines that I listed here. And then the elements of fiction and analysis are just where I will look at your paper and see if you talked about each of the elements and kind of threaded it all together. All right, so that's the paper guidelines. If you have questions, please feel free to email me, or when you turn in your thesis, you can ask questions as well, and I can get back to you via that. But those are the paper guidelines. All right, and as for this video, I'm going to be housing it down here or rather here in the video links next to the MLA presentation if you've not watched that. So that's pretty much it for our class housekeeping there. Now, onto the slideshow, and it's not a long slideshow, but Fiction Part 2, Chapters 5 through 8. Chapter 5 starts on page 180, and it is about point of view. So point of view is the viewpoint that the story is told from. It usually involves what we call a narrator, and there are 4 different main kinds of narrators that our chapter talks about that you need to know for our exam on fiction. The first type is called the limited narrator, and this is a fairly common type of narrator. It's where we only know what the narrator knows, and we learn about the story as the main character does, or as the narrator does. So I often think of Katniss in Hunger Games as being a limited narrator. We see first-person account of what happens to her. We don't know any more than she does, and as she experiences things in the story, so do we. So that's a limited narrator. Omniscient, I think, is the one that we think of most, even if we don't know what it's called, and that is the narrator that knows all. The narrator has already seen everything that has happened in the story, and we are just flies on the wall watching the story take place. So usually when a character recounts a memory and that's the story, then we're using omniscient narrator. So I guess I'm trying to think of an example where an omniscient narrator occurs. I always think of Milo and Otis, the classic story from when I was a kid. It was like a little movie with a dog and a cat. That was an omniscient narrator because the narrator sort of already knows what's going to happen. An intruding narrator is a more modern style of narration, and that is where the narrator, quote unquote, breaks the fourth wall and interacts with the readers. And obviously, the biggest example I can think of is Deadpool. My younger brother is crazy about Deadpool and all of the comics, but this character, if you ever look up Deadpool, he's this satirical superhero, and he constantly interacts with the audience and lets them know that he knows he's in a comic book, and it's very kind of tongue-in-cheek, and that's what an intruding narrator does. Or, like I said, I have small cousins. If you watch The Emperor's New Groove, the Disney movie, where David Spade as the llama kind of stops the reel and he marks through the picture of John Goodman's character, yeah, that's an intruding narrator. Someone that kind of breaks the story up and talks to the audience as the story is being told. And then finally, third-person objective tells the story very matter-of-factly, almost like a documentary. So if you can imagine March of the Penguins, where Morgan Freeman narrates the penguin's journey, that would be third-person objective, where they're just telling you the facts. It's very clear-cut, dry, not much emotion into it at all. All right, these other definitions here, one is confessional tone, and that's where the story is written almost like a diary entry or a confession to the audience. There's lots of these. I mean, they're even in the title. So, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Diary of Anne Frank. There's a whole Memoirs of a Geisha is very much confessional tone. So there's a lot of different examples of that. If you write a story about yourself for paper 1, you may consider using a confessional tone as you tell the story because it creates more of a personal connection between the audience and you as the writer. So there's that. Irony, I will say this about irony in this textbook. It is mentioned a lot, and I don't think the book ever gets the definition right. If you look in this textbook, they define it with each unit we look at. They define it 2 or 3 times in fiction alone, and I don't think they get it right. I don't know what it is, but irony, they always seem to find a different way to define it, and I'm never comfortable with any of the ways they give. So what I've put down here is irony will be defined multiple ways, but here it's when events happen the opposite of what conditions create for them. So, for example, everything is set up perfectly and then something exactly the opposite happens without any rhyme or reason. That could be considered irony. I know Alanis Morissette's song Ironic is not entirely ironic, but there's bits and pieces of that song such as rain on your wedding day. You set up all these conditions where this wedding should be this perfect occasion, and it rains, theoretically ruining things. That could be irony. Again, it's very hard to define, and people have different definitions for it, so you'll probably run into that throughout this book. Just kind of keep that in mind. Finally, though, a reflector is our last term, and that is when the narrator, we see through their eyes and hear their thoughts as they go about their journey. So anytime we get into the narrator's head and see what they're thinking, that is a reflector. Alright, so that's pretty much it about point of view. The main thing, though, is to, and I know I talked about this in part 1, is to think of your tenses. So you have first person, second person, third person. As long as your story is consistent, or as long as the paper is consistent. So if you're writing a short story for this paper 1 and you go with first person, you just make sure that you stick with that point of view. You don't change it halfway through the story, because that is something I will take note of and be looking for when I grade your papers. Alright? Chapter 6 starts a little bit later, and it is all about symbolism, which I love looking into symbolism. Alright, it's page 216 in our book. So symbols are images that have meaning beyond themselves, such as a shared language symbol, a special meaning, ambiguity, or a symbol that gains meaning in context. And I meant to have pictures beside this, but the pictures, I couldn't find one that I exactly wanted. A shared language symbol just means that everyone in a culture knows exactly what that symbol means. So when you go to a stoplight and you're sitting there, the light turns red, what do? Preferably you stop, right? And when the light turns green, what do? You go. Those lights don't have the words stop or go on them. Usually, there are some stoplights that do, but for the most part, they don't have those words on them. So how do you know that green means go and red means stop? Because it's a shared language symbol. For our culture, we understand that a red light means to stop and a green light means to go. That's just a shared language symbol we have adopted as a culture. And it's kind of cool when you think about it, because you're like, man, there are so many things that I look at and interact with, and they don't really have any text associated, but I just know what that meaning is. And that's what symbolism is. It's extra meaning in your story. Maybe parts of the story have a special meaning to the author. Maybe the author has his character followed around by an Irish setter because he grew up with an Irish setter and it represented his childhood and his innocence and youth. That could be a special meaning symbol that is only unique to the author and only has special meaning to the author, but we still, as readers, get to interact with it. And then ambiguity is when symbols don't exactly have a full meaning that is clear. They can be ambiguous. They can mean different things to different people depending on who reads them. For example, maybe a character has mixed-matched socks on, and some reader may take that to mean that, oh, well, they're disheveled and unorganized, but another reader may think that that means, oh no, they're creative and unique and quirky. So there's not a real definition with an ambiguous symbol, but they can still be used and used effectively. And then finally, symbols that gain meaning in context. All this means is that a symbol doesn't have a complete meaning until the end of the story. And I always think of Lord of the Rings when the ring is finally taken to Mordor and thrown in the fire, and we see kind of the ruin it's caused Frodo and his friends, and the whole meaning behind the ring and its symbolism and its kind of powers to contribute to people's selfishness and greed finally become realized in those last moments of the ring being on screen. So it gains its meaning in context. But yeah, just kind of look in your book on page 217 and 218. They go into a lot of detail about these types of symbols, and you will be tested on this, so just be aware of that. More terminology. I like the symbolism chapter because they go into different aspects of symbolism, not just colors and names and mythology like I talked in the last video, but actual movements, which I think is kind of cool. The first is naturalism on page 221. I, as an English major, can tell you that I am not a fan of Victorian literature. I had to study it. I didn't like it. It's mainly hoity-toity elite people talking about their problems. It is the Kardashians of the literature world in the 18 and 1700s, and I just never got into it. So I was pretty excited in my English courses when we got to naturalism because it is kind of the spark of revolt against Victorian idealism and, oh no, I'm rich and have problems. So naturalism is creating stories and characters that are catered to more common physical and emotional needs. When we get to drama, we'll talk about American drama, and it's kind of a version of naturalism. But the idea is that readers were tired, by the end of the Victorian literature era, readers were getting tired about reading about these rich people and their problems. People were saying to themselves, I can't relate to these characters, so I need something that's more quote unquote real. And that's kind of where naturalism started to happen. People were writing stories about more common folk in the communities and about more traditional and common scenarios. So it was a pretty big, significant movement away from Victorian literature that created that, but that's what that term means. In addition, books often are used as social protest. This is not anything new. It's been happening for centuries. The two contemporary ones that I think are the best examples, though, are The Grapes of Wrath and The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. The Jungle is about labor conditions in Chicago factories in the early 20th century, and it's an excellent book. It's terrifying because it's all based on true events, and the working conditions those people worked in was just atrocious. Grapes of Wrath, I don't know if any of you have read Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. I was in a book club with some friends, and they convinced me to read Grapes of Wrath, and on the last page, I chucked it across the room and was very angry. If you've never read Grapes of Wrath, I won't spoil it for you, but the story is basically, it occurs during the Great Depression, and this family from the East Coast decide to pack up everything they own and move out Oregon Trail style out west to California to find jobs. And things don't go as planned. Lots of stuff happens. It's a long book, but at the end, the ending is so weird and so indescribable that I was very frustrated when it ended, but looking back, I'm like, okay, I get why the author did this. It's just read Grapes of Wrath if you ever get a chance. But you need a big chance because it's a big old book. But anyway, it was a form of social protest. It was talking about the struggles people were going through at that time. And so it was a pretty important text for people to read. And that's pretty much it for symbolism. They have stories called Chrysanthemums, which is pretty good. And then The Yellow Wallpaper, which I think every college class pretty much has you read. If you've not read The Yellow Wallpaper, you should. It's good. But I want to get to chapter 7, which is about theme. A theme starts on page 260, and it's basically the point or message behind the story. It is what the story means or what its point is. And it's pretty important. Theme is really what gets people to think about your story after you're done writing it. They think, okay, what was the meaning behind that? Oh, okay. And they get to talking to other people, and your story kind of spreads from there, right? So when you are creating a theme for your own story, there are a series of things you should avoid. Mainly 3 things to avoid with theme. First, large abstractions. You don't want to make your message or point of your story vague. You want it to be clear-cut and simple. And if you want to make a complex theme, that's fine, but still make it clear and easy to understand. Because if you make it too complicated, your readers will sort of get lost. The same thing, don't be oversimplified either. Don't be too simple with your theme. Don't be like, oh yeah, love's great. What else? So don't be too simple and avoid cliches or themes that are overdone or expected. You want to challenge your audience. You want to give them something fresh and new to think about. So just try to steer away from things that you know are overdone or that you've seen a dozen times with stories. All right. And then the last term there is ambiguity. It's where you leave a story open-ended or vague. Now this kind of flies in contradiction to the oversimplification avoidance that you want to make sure to stay away from, because you're like, well, now wait a minute. You want to leave the story open-ended or vague? It has to be intentional. You have to set things up for your audience, and then if you want to do that, fine. But usually when it's done haphazardly or lazily, it's easy to tell. So if I can tell you're deliberately trying to leave stuff ambiguous, you'll be fine. And then that's it for theme. You'll notice that some of these chapters, a lot of them are very much story driven, so you have lots of examples. And this is especially true of these last couple of chapters. Some of these stories in these last couple of chapters we'll actually have in our discussion forums or reading responses to look at, so just keep that in mind. But our last chapter here is chapter 8, which is style, a very overlooked element. Style, it can be very simple. It can just be the way that the writer writes, the way they use characters, or it can be very complex. It can have multiple layers and invoke styles from other writers and the way they use dialogue and things like that. But style is pretty much unique to each writer. Understatement is where you make the text shorter or choppier to add dramatic effect. So, for example, I use Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, which is one of my favorite books, to kind of talk about this line. They all died. So it goes. So it goes is used a lot in Slaughterhouse-Five, and it's a very powerful line. It's very short, but it's just implying that, oh, that's just the way things are. And these horrible incidents will happen in the book, and then Vonnegut will say, oh, well, that's just the way it is. So it goes. And it's almost heartbreaking at times as you read, because you're like, well, no, it shouldn't be this way. But that's just his use of understatement. He's making things deliberately short and concise so that they can kind of tailor-make anybody that comes to listen about them. And then that person can get a different meaning from it, and it creates more dialogue and conversation about what you're writing about. A hyperbole is the exact opposite, though. It is a deliberate exaggeration. So if I say, for example, the marathon was so exhausting, he felt like he could barely walk another step. Could he barely walk another step? Well, no, he's probably fine. But that's just what hyperbole is. It's just an exaggeration. All right, this chapter especially, when you get to pages 310 and 311, they like to do a lot of comparisons. So I've kind of labeled them here. The first is abstract versus concrete. And I'm surprised that people miss this question as often as they do. Abstract are things you cannot touch. They are ideas that are undefined. So love, freedom, happiness, those are things that can't be measured in a scientific way or in a tangible way. They will be different for everyone that interacts with them. But there are some things that are concrete, meaning we can interact with them in reality. And that could be, your hair, a chair, a dog, things like that. Denotation versus connotation. Denotation is the exact definition of something. So when someone's like, what does this mean? Or what is this? You can be like, well, yeah, it can go, or no, it's going to stay. Connotation is the emotional context or meaning behind something. And that just means, what does something mean to a person? And that can vary from person to person. It's very subjective. And then we have metaphors versus similes. Metaphors, I believe, are getting harder and harder to create because we don't use them as much. We use similes a lot. And I think that is because we use the word like a lot in our culture. I don't know why it started that way, but it has become a word we use very often. And so I feel similes are easier to come by. Similes is just comparing two things with the words like or as. Metaphor is comparing two things without doing that. So if I were to say, her skin felt as if it were on fire, That's a simile because I use as if it were on fire. But if I just said, her skin felt on fire, that's a metaphor. Not a very good one, mind you, but a metaphor. And so these terms on here, you will need to know the difference between because they will be on your exam, most definitely. All right. And then as far as other terms go with style, dialogue we've talked about is the conversations between two characters. It's often a stylistic choice by the author, whether or not they want to include it. Parallelism is the repetition of grammar and similar elements in the story, often the beginning and the end match to create a rhythm or a pattern. Sentimentality, stories designed to make the readers feel illicit emotional responses such as pity and sadness and empathy. I don't know if you all have ever read Where the Red Fern Grows. It is sentimentality mush. It's such a sad story, but that's what it's there for. It's trying to tug at your heartstrings. It's trying to make you cry, and that's absolutely what sentimentality is. And then postmodern. Postmodern gets thrown around a lot, and I think a lot of people aren't sure what it means. Postmodernism is just any style that the author is aware of what it is. So for example, Victorian lit in the 1800s was not called Victorian literature. It was just literature. But now we call it Victorian lit because that's just the style it emulates. So postmodernism would be creating a story knowing what genre you're going to put it in. So a horror story that knows it's a horror story, or if somebody's like, oh, it's an action movie and it knows it. That's what I mean by postmodern. It kind of comments on its own style and is self-aware of what genre it's in. And that's it. That's it for Fiction Part 2. As you can see, our chapters 1 through 9 are 300 pages, most of which are example stories. So you will be having an exam next week over fiction chapters 1 through 8. It's not anything to freak out about. It'll just be 25 questions or less. It's worth 25 points. And it's just going to be asking questions like what you've seen in the slideshows. Definitions, examples, not anything too hard. So if you guys have questions, please email me. But otherwise, you do have some assignments due this week and next week, which is spring break. There is an outage scheduled on my SIC definitely for the 12th and the 13th, which is Monday and Tuesday. I was told as an instructor it may carry over to the 14th, but after the 14th we should be able to get online. Now some students have told me that we're supposed to be out until the 16th. There's only one assignment due for regular points, which is the scavenger hunt. I'm going to extend it to where you have until week 3 to get it done. I would try to get it done early because you have a lot due in week 3 and you don't have as much due week 1 or 2. So I would try to get all that done beforehand. And then, yeah, otherwise, I will talk to you guys later. I hope you have a great day and let me know if you have any questions.